Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The other day, I made a video clip in which I was arguing that the return of Nelson Chamisa to active politics after his long sabbatical started in January 2024 when he resigned from being the leader of Triple C and said he was not going to be actively involved in politics. The other day, he announced that he's back. In the video, I argued that Nelson Chamisa's return will only mean one thing. He's going to con millions of his brain dead. This is not an insult, it's just stating a fact. Followers to participate in the 2028 elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy and thus perpetuate the dictatorship. Of course, they are brain dead. I've been warned countless times that the election process is so flawed, so illegal. The only logical step is to withdraw, as David Coltart admitted. And so to keep on participating beggars belief. But the reply to my video was typically what I'm showing there on the screen, where the individual is asking me, form your own party and push for the democratic reforms before the elections in 2028. There's plenty of time. If I had insisted, and whoever makes such a suggestion that they should donate 1 ZiG, I think by now I'll have a mountain of ZiGs. But would that have solved the problem? No. Zimbabwe will still be plagued with the problem of rigged elections, of participating in flawed elections only to give ZANU-PF legitimacy and perpetuate the nation's problem of bad governance. The suggestion, in my view, was being made in the same fashion, one would say, of a meerkat. That when confronted with an ostrich egg, would know that inside there's food. It would have confronted eggs before, smaller eggs, which it would easily crack once it gets its teeth onto the shell. But with the ostrich egg, of course, the poor meerkat cannot open its mouth wide enough to have a purchase on the egg. And so it resorts to its only other way of solving problem: dig. Needless to say, of course, the meerkat did not have its meal. The problem with the meerkat is that it cannot think of any other way out, and so it has got to dig. But after a while, even the meerkat will realize that it will not crack that egg and will abandon the egg and look for other food. The idea that forming political parties will solve Zimbabwe's problem of rigged elections and bad governance beggars belief. In 2018, the country had no fewer than 130 political parties that participated in those elections, to say nothing of the independent candidates. That did not solve the problem, of course, because as we know, millions of Zimbabweans participated in those elections because most of them believed Chamisa's argument that MDC alliance had stringent measures to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. That MDC alliance was going to win those elections. And they believed it. In 2023, I believe there would have been even more political parties if Mnangagwa had not introduced the rule demanding that all the presidential candidates should pay a deposit of 20,000 US dollars. Parliamentary candidates, 1,000 US dollars, etc., etc. Of course, most people could not afford that. And so the number of parties was considerably reduced. But the point is, it is not the number of political parties that will help solve Zimbabwe's problem. This is just the meerkat, having failed to crack the egg, resorting to digging. After 45 years of rigged elections, the common sense position should be people should realize that we are not going to win rigged elections. What we need is to implement the democratic reforms to ensure elections are free, fair, and credible. This takes us back to the late 1990s. To 20 years of independence, the people of Zimbabwe realized that as long as ZANU-PF is able to rig elections, absolutely nothing would change. Nothing. And so they came to a consensus that they needed to elect opposition parties whose number one task would be to implement the democratic reforms to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. What happened? MDC had the opportunity to implement the reforms, but unfortunately, they sold out. During the 2008 to 2018, Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends had the golden opportunity to implement the reforms. But they failed to implement even one. They turned out to be so breathtakingly incompetent and corrupt. Mugabe had no problem bribing them, and they forgot all about the reforms. The people of Zimbabwe have been slow in accepting that the opposition, the MDC opposition, has turned out to be corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless. In 2004, Ambassador to Zimbabwe, the US Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Chris Dale, said this about Morgan Tsvangirai, that Morgan Tsvangirai is a flawed figure, not readily open to advice, indecisive, and with questionable judgment. And if he was to get into power, he would be an albatross around the nation's neck. He said this in a secret cable back to Washington, USA, that was later leaked and was made public. He was, of course, right. Morgan Tsvangirai was a flawed figure. There cannot be any doubt about it. In fact, the ambassador could have said the same about all those around him. Because the MDC leaders were in the GNU of 2008 to 2018, and they failed to implement even one token democratic reform because they are corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless. Having failed to implement any meaningful reforms, what they did next was to tell the people that the nation did not need the reforms anymore because they could win rigged elections. There is the catch. And ever since, Zimbabweans have been like the meerkat, trying to win rigged elections. Even after 45 years, some people still believe they can win rigged elections. They've come up with all manner of rational arguments why they should keep on participating in flawed elections. In 2023, Chamisa's argument was that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. Hashtag God is in it. He even invoked the name of God. Of course, he didn't win the elections. And now somebody's coming up with their own argument. We need more opposition political parties. Just the list is endless. But the point is, this is no more effective than the meerkat digging and rolling the ostrich egg back and forth because it cannot think of any other way of cracking the egg. In the case of Zimbabwe, we have a way of cracking, ending this case of rigged elections. We have to revert back to the rational argument, implement the democratic reforms to ensure elections are free, fair, and credible, and have the common sense to enforce the rule. The ZANU-PF is not above the law. SADC and the AU, credit where credit is due, in 2023 condemned Zimbabwe's election because they are flawed. And SADC would have gone one step further and denied ZANU-PF legitimacy if Zimbabweans had not participated in those flawed elections in their millions. The question then is, why do you keep on participating in your millions in flawed elections? ZANU-PF itself, of course, has got the motive to participate. Why not? If they want to stay in power and they can rig elections and get away with it, of course they will rig elections again and again and again. The opposition, Chamisa and company, want to participate in these flawed elections because they are compromised. When they failed to implement even one token reform during the GNU, that was the point of no return. They can no longer pretend they can implement the reforms. And so they've got now to pretend they can win rigged elections. If they were to be sincere and say that they can implement the reforms, the most rational question one would ask is, why didn't you implement the reforms all along? During the GNU, when you had the best opportunity to do so. They can't answer that. And so they now are stuck with this nonsensical solution where they've now convinced their followers they can win rigged elections. It is the people themselves who have got to wake up to the reality that this is not the solution. Just because Chamisa and company failed to implement their reforms doesn't mean there's nobody else out there who can implement the reforms. The starting point is to accept that Chamisa and company sold out and it is futile to keep participating in flawed elections. I dismiss with the contempt it rightly deserves this whole argument that somehow, if we have more political parties participating in these flawed elections, we'll get one of those opposition parties to win the rigged elections. This is just a nonsense solution. We have got, at least the makers had the common sense to know that after digging around the egg, rolling the egg around for a while, they gave up. Why is it that some people, even after 25 years of rigged elections, they still believe they can win rigged elections? Beggars belief. We need to wake up as a people. We cannot afford to have rigged elections and perpetuate this madness. At the present moment, ZANU-PF has got no motivation to implement reforms because they know the opposition would participate no matter how flawed the process happens to be. It is the people themselves who have got to realize that the opposition are no longer fighting in their corner. And if the people themselves are so naive and gullible as to believe the lie that the opposition can win rigged elections, even after 45 years of ZANU-PF rigging the elections, then the nation is doomed. Chamisa is back into politics. And his number one purpose would be to con people to believe that this time he will win the 2028 elections with no reform. My argument is that is a lie, and we should not fall for it. Creating more political parties will not solve the problem of people being so naive and gullible as to believe they can win rigged elections. That is the message. Thank you very much. Have a good day.